IoT Unplugged, where we talk to industry leaders, innovators, and major players in the Internet of Things, bringing you the best and latest insights. Tune in to learn more. In this episode, I discuss the topic of embedded security versus cybersecurity with Christopher Schouten, Senior Director, IoT Security at Kudelski IoT. We also talk about the threat landscape, the PSTI regulation, and general recommendations for ensuring device security. Welcome back, everyone, to Season 3 of IoT Unplugged. For this episode, I'm joined by Christopher Schouten, Senior Director of IoT Security at Kudelski IoT. Christopher, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So for our listeners, could you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role at Kudelski IoT?
Sure. My name is Christopher Schouten, as you mentioned, and I'm in charge of all of the marketing activities around IoT security for Kudelski IoT. Kudelski IoT is part of the Kudelski Group, which has been in business since 1951, creating technological innovation, and in the last 30 years focusing primarily on digital security, primarily in the pay TV space. So any of your listeners in the UK would know us as the company behind the protection of Virgin Media's cable network and the content that they serve, in addition to many of the largest pay TV operators around the world. And that expertise in encryption and operational security is what inspired us to start Kudelski IoT about 7 or 8 years ago, with a focus on helping semiconductor companies and IoT device manufacturers secure all aspects of their business.
Great, thank you for that. Recently, for IoT Insider, you wrote about the major differences between embedded security and cybersecurity. Before we kind of get into that in more depth as the sort of guiding topic of our conversation today, I guess I just wanted to get your overall opinion on, the threat landscape today. How does it look? How did it compare to previous years? Could you sort of give us an overview on that?
Well, I think as IoT devices proliferate in the market to the tune of many billions, the threat landscape and the threat surface has become much larger than it ever has before. Consumers are adopting the usefulness of smart home devices more and more, which just creates a bigger attack surface in homes. And because that market is highly competitive, a lot of these device manufacturers have gone to market without taking the necessary security precautions that they should have to make sure that consumers' privacy and data and the devices themselves are sufficiently protected in the home.
Yeah, based on a couple of conversations I've had with people in the industry recently, they've spoken about the increase in these smart devices, as you sort of outlined, having a smart fridge, having a smart TV, and sort of maybe the cybersecurity being an afterthought. Would you say that's the case, or has it improved?
The competition in the market and the rush to get innovative products to market has prioritized functionality and time to market over security in most cases. So that's why you see, even with the introduction of PSTI in the UK, you've seen some companies have to take their connected devices offline and publicly announce to their customers that these devices can no longer have the connected services offered because they don't comply with PSTI regulation. So you can see that there has been a lack of prioritization of security. Unfortunately, many companies consider it to be an expense and a time-consuming effort, but there are a lot of developments in the market that we can talk about that are making it easier to implement IoT security going forward.
Before we get onto that, you mentioned the PSTI Act, which, as you also said, is within the UK and was an act passed in April to sort of tackle this issue of, the threat surface or the attack surface not being thought about. Do you think it's going to have a positive impact going forward, or, more generally, what do you think the impact of the act will be?
Well, I think the PSTI Act is just good common sense security, and it's very similar to many of the regulations going on throughout Europe, Asia, and the United States as well. And they have a lot of commonalities, and that's good news for device manufacturers because it means that they're going to be implementing one set of requirements that are just basic common sense for security that will help them then get certification for implementing their devices around the world. So I think it will make a difference. I think people have yet to fully wake up to the importance of this and the fact that it's actually happening. Luckily, there are also organizations out there like the Connectivity Standards Alliance and their Product Security Working Group, which we have a leadership role in, to make sure that these different requirements are harmonized so that you might be able to, for instance, pass one product security working group certification and then have that device be certified according to multiple regulations in multiple geographies around the world. So sort of one certification to rule them all.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that. It's quite good because I suspect at the moment it feels that the certifications, or more to the point, cybersecurity regulations aren't standardized. So in the UK, we have the PSTI Act, but that's not necessarily the case in Europe and the US. Is that right?
You have the CRA in Europe starting to take form, and you also have the White House having taken some initiative in the United States with a cyber trust mark that is in the process of being looked at as well. And I think all of these things hope to achieve the same exact goal, which is to create a product that is secure by design and who has a security lifecycle that's managed throughout the useful lifetime of the product, or at least for a minimum specified period of time. And so that these devices, again, are secure by design and don't have to be necessarily managed top down from the networks from a cybersecurity perspective, but are already secure bottom up.
So let's talk about this concept secure by design. In your piece, you wrote about embedded security and you differentiated it from conventional cybersecurity. So, how does it differ and what are sort of the main talking points?
Sure. So I always like to take a hospital as an example. A hospital is purchasing multiple pieces of connected equipment of very high value. They're dealing with a lot of very sensitive patient data. And it's essentially an environment that we've seen in practice is rife for cyber attacks. And we've seen entire hospitals shut down in the US because of this. The traditional approach is for all of the responsibility to lie with the IT department of the hospital to deal with this problem. So they take a sort of network down approach to making sure that devices are assumed to be malicious and that they're managed in such a way that if they, for some reason, do engage in malicious activity on the network, that this can be stopped. The opposite approach is for the manufacturers of all of those devices to begin with some basic design principles in the design and architecture process to make sure that those devices are secure by design and that they don't wreak havoc on the network because they have a unique manageable identity, for instance, that's embedded in the hardware that is unclonable, it's secret, it's only known by the device and the servers that are authorized to communicate and manage the device. Then there's things like firmware over the air updates, where you can make sure that anything downloaded onto that device, that new image of firmware or software is cryptographically signed and will only be accepted by the device if that is the case. And also that all communications between the device and the cloud or across the local network are encrypted so that they can't be intercepted. If you do this, it makes cybersecurity ultimately unnecessary and puts the onus then on the device manufacturers to make sure um, that their devices are secure by design. And we think that this is an important shift in mindset. It's what the different regulations around the world are demanding, is that there be a stronger focus on the security by design aspect.
Yeah, and interesting you use this word, the word onus. Do you think the onus should be on the device manufacturer to ensure the device is secure before it gets used in the example you gave, like in a hospital?
Absolutely, and not only initially when it goes into the market, but also throughout the lifetime of the product as well. The manufacturer needs to continue to take an interest in ensuring that it's updated on a regular basis. You have a lot of players in the industry across different verticals who would say, I just want to get my product out the door and then move on to the very next one. Even semiconductor manufacturers historically have taken that approach. But you see all of them now starting to wake up to the importance of security lifecycle management and realize we don't know today what tomorrow's threat landscape is going to be. So the only way to deal with that is to be prepared with a dynamic infrastructure built into the device that allows for it to be updated over time. Because of that, we're seeing some downward pressure from device manufacturers to their semiconductor suppliers to say, hey, you're the best place for this security to reside. Can you please help us with that? And so we have a number of different partners in the market, including Microchip, ST, Infineon, Silicon Labs, and others who are working with us in various different capacities to embed security into the chip in a way that then we can manage it over time, so that all of these functions that we talked about, encryption, authentication, data protection, device protection, can take place. And so there is movement in the market. People are waking up. They're realizing regulation is coming. And now we're starting to put the infrastructure in place to make both security by design and lifecycle management a reality.
So we're seeing this sort of shift, as you described it, towards embedded security. In your opinion, sort of how does the market look right now in terms of, is the uptake as great as it should be, or are still conventional cybersecurity methods being employed today?
Well, I think those will always be necessary because we'll always have legacy devices out there that are not as well protected as the ones of the future will be. And indeed, we have a cybersecurity company within the group that deals specifically with that question. And you'll always have computers and computer networks that need to be very heavily protected. But from a device perspective, we are starting to see people wake up. We're starting to see with things like the Matter standard in the smart home, there being an increased interest and activity around supporting security in devices. Kudelski IoT is a device attestation authority to provide Matter certificates to smart home device manufacturers so that after they've gone through the entire certification process, they have this security certificate, this device attestation certificate from us that proves that they are certified and can participate in the Matter network. And that already starts to then raise the level of security in the smart home through the Matter standard. So there are excellent steps taking place in the right direction. It won't be overnight. When we got into this business 7-8 years ago, based on our 30 years worth of history in key management and operational security, we realized it was going to be a long game. But that we see a fundamental shift happening now with the regulations and standards pushing every industry more and more towards security by design.
Could you talk about how a device manufacturer can go about implementing embedded security? Where does it start?
It starts by really understanding the regulations and the threats. So one of the things we can help our customers with is a regulatory gap analysis, because our IoT security labs in Switzerland are constantly working with multiple industries and multiple devices from around the world. We have a really good understanding of not only the basics of embedded security to begin with, but increasingly a lot of the specific standards. In addition to that, the very next step is conducting, even before you design the device, a very thorough threat and risk analysis that will ensure that you understand the threat landscape and you understand the things that could have a tangibly negative impact on your product. Because once you understand these things, you can then start to create security that will mitigate any of those potential threats. If there's a threat that costs $1 billion to execute and is very unlikely to happen, you're not going to worry about that. But if there's one that has a really large impact on your business and it's potentially very easy to execute, then you'll design measures to prevent that from happening. And that's how we help our customers prioritize these things. So that's sort of the first step. And then beyond that, it's really very often about selecting the right semiconductor partner. These days, device manufacturers are lucky. They don't have to design security from scratch. Increasingly, we're working with the partners that I mentioned earlier to really embed robust security infrastructure into the chipsets so that things like secure boot, cryptographic engines, true random number generators, hardware-based key storage, secure execution of code can all be done using the tools that we provide within the chipset. And then after that, the next step is to make sure that in your software that you write, make sure that you actually implement the security measures that are available in the hardware. This is one of the things that we see most frequently missed is people have all these great features in security available to them, and then in their code they don't implement them. So that's an easy win for a lot of developers is to understand what your existing hardware already offers you and then try and take advantage of that. And then just one last step is once you've done all this work, you need to make sure you've done it right. You need to get a third party independent assessment and find out through an independent lab like Kudelski IoT Security Labs or another one that you haven't left any significant gaps in the actual end product. And that's why in our labs, we have the ability to do the most advanced attacks that exist to be able to determine whether or not your device has any of those security gaps that need to be mitigated.
What kind of threats are facing manufacturers today? Do you see any trends in how these attacks are manifesting?
This is a great question, and it's something that I frequently ask our security labs to give me some advice for, because you can imagine it would create great content if we could share this is the most common thing. And their answer to me for the last few years has always been the same. They said, Christopher, we don't see any two gaps that are the same among different devices. I think I mentioned one that tends to pop up more often than not, and that's the failure to implement the features that are already existing in hardware through the software. But beyond that, it's really quite unique to the individual device. I think the regulations address a lot of the basics, like no default passwords, the need to have secure firmware updates and things like this um, are all being addressed on a basic level. But any of the more advanced ones, they tend to be very specific to the use case and to the device.
So is kind of what you're saying the threats that face these different industries are they in a way tailored, or have I sort of misunderstood?
No, they are very different depending on the specific industry, the specific use case and device. And it really leads these companies to a point where they either need to have internal security expertise if they're big enough to be able to look at their security architectures and their end devices, or they need to seek third-party help from companies like us to be able to really understand the threats to then actually evaluate the device after it's been created to determine if any of those threats are still possible. And it's going to be different for every single device.
Earlier, Christopher, you said something that really struck me, which was in relation to the PSTI Act. You said that since it came into law, some manufacturers have had to recall products because they're not compliant. And so it got me thinking about what's at stake for manufacturers who are attacked, and what industries are vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
Yeah, and it strikes me that if I was reading correctly in the PSTI Act, that I believe the penalties can be up to 10 million pounds or 4% of global revenue, something like that. So we're talking about a really tangible threat of financial harm if people aren't paying attention to these things. But I think that impact is pretty huge and needs to have serious attention paid to it.
Yeah, and curious to get your thoughts on this. The message you want to impart is not that, you need to be compliant or you get fined, but just you need to make sure your device is secure because that's what's important.
Well, exactly. We're talking not only about regulatory compliance, we're also talking about your brand's reputation, your ability to serve your customers, your ability to not leak their data, which can lead to legal liabilities, outside of the regulatory regime, just from a civil lawsuit perspective as well. But most importantly, just doing the right thing for your customer and having a security first approach and embedding this culture and this expertise into your organization enables you to have all of this not be an urgent fire drill, but rather to be part of your culture and to make sure it's really embedded in the way you do things. Just like organizations will frequently look at their development methodology and say, okay, we think we want to adopt waterfall, or we want to adopt agile, or we want to adopt a specific flavor of agile. It's just as important to look at how you look at security in your organization and how you embed that what we're finding is that in most successful organizations, what they either do is just like you separate development from testing very often so that there's no bias between the two, also to have security as a separate element within that as well, so that they're holding the developers honest about how they develop things, to have that expertise internally, again, if you have the scale to support it, or relying on companies like Kudelski IoT if you don't have the scale to support it, or to bring us in just on a temporary basis for things like training, advisory, things of these natures to get people on the right track. I think those are the best approaches to take.
I think that's a really good point. With all of that said, what would be your more general recommendations for manufacturers in ensuring devices are secure?
So I think it's pretty much similar to what I said before. Understand your threats, pick the right silicon partner who has the security features that are going to make your job easier ultimately, not having to develop them from scratch, but being able to leverage them in hardware. That way you get performance, you get ease of use, quicker time to market because those things are already there. And ultimately, security in hardware is always more robust than security in software. Make sure you get an independent third-party view of your work after it's been done so that you can release uh, with confidence into the market. And then last but not least, security is not finished when your product leaves the door. It's just starting. And realize that you have to put an infrastructure in place to have post-market surveillance so that you understand what's going on out there in the marketplace with the threat landscape, and that you can take corrective action as necessary because regulation will require that.
Yeah, a really important note to end on: security doesn't end as soon as your device enters the market. Do you have any closing remarks for those who are listening?
Security is an opportunity. I know a lot of people look at it as a cost and a hindrance, but going forward, that culture globally is changing towards being the foundation of the IoT. And a lot of us have been saying that for years and have believed that very strongly. But now regulation is coming into play, consumer demand is coming into play to say, hey, device manufacturers, we need you to do a better job. We know you can do it. The architecture and infrastructure out there from the semiconductor manufacturers is starting to come into play. And companies like Kudelski IoT are here to help you from A to Z if you need any support in that process.
Thank you for talking to me, Christopher. It was really great to hear your insights and a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
IoT Unplugged,